This video was made possible thanks to Olly, offering unlimited data for your next trip in seconds. More on that in a moment. Georgia has taken it to the streets. From the end of October last year until now, there has been a succession of mass protests that demonstrate only one thing: this country is stuck in a dark place. And okay, some of you may be thinking, why the hell should I care about all this? Why do protests in a remote country like Georgia matter? Well, they matter for several reasons. To begin with, Georgia is seen as the forerunner of everything that has followed with the invasion of Ukraine. In 2008, and it has almost been 17 years since then, the country also suffered a Russian invasion, which, by the way, was quite a disaster. Besides that, a good chunk of the country is made up of self-proclaimed people's republics in the service of Moscow. I'm talking about South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Two places that, as I said, declared themselves independent republics that practically nobody recognizes except for Moscow. And take note, this represents about 20% of the country's territory, which is not exactly small. All this sounds familiar, doesn't it? You only need to look at what happened in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea from 2014. So yes, Georgia was clearly a precursor to Ukraine. And do you know what has happened since then? Well, this small Caucasus country has gone from being a staunch ally of the West and a formal hopeful for joining NATO and the European Union to being ever closer to Moscow. Pay attention to this because it may be a warning about the real intentions that the Kremlin has in Ukraine. But first, let's talk about a common challenge when traveling abroad. How do we manage once we arrive? How do we handle language barriers, find our way around unfamiliar cities, or discover the best local restaurants? And just as importantly, how do we stay connected for work, keep in touch with loved ones, and access essential travel apps? The answer is clear. We rely on our smartphones. But without internet access, a smartphone is like a compass without a needle. It simply won't get you far. That's why having a reliable connection is essential. At VisualPolitik, we've already found the perfect solution: Olly. With Olly, you don't need to spend a fortune on international roaming to stay connected. Instead, you get a simple, hassle-free alternative. Thanks to Olly's eSIM, you can skip the hassle of swapping out your physical SIM card, eliminating the risk of losing it. Instead, you get seamless connectivity in over 200 destinations with unlimited data, so you won't have to rely on spotty Wi-Fi or expensive roaming fees. It's incredibly easy. Visit their app or website and choose the plan that suits your needs. Install the international eSIM instantly via QR code or directly through the app. And that's it. You're ready to explore, contact your accommodation, or share your experiences with family and friends. With Olly's unlimited data eSIMs, staying connected while traveling has never been easier. Check the link in the description to get a 5% discount on any plan and destination with your next purchase. The fact is, the Georgian Dream Party that has been running the country since 2012 has taken an increasingly intense turn towards Moscow. So despite having suffered a war in 2008, this time, Georgia didn't even impose sanctions on Moscow following the invasion on Ukraine. It has only limited itself to complying, and extremely dubiously, with some of the sanctions imposed by the United States and the European Union. And I repeat, there are many doubts. Because the truth is that there are many allegations that the country is actually serving as a bridge for Moscow to bypass these punishments, something that may have been particularly crucial during the first year of the war. In what way were they helpful? Well, you see, several investigations indicate that products sanctioned by the West, such as technology, chips, and machinery, have been arriving in Russia through Georgia, particularly through the Lars Pass, a key border crossing between the two countries. What's more, a lot of Georgian-based companies have been accused of re-exporting products to Russia from the EU and other countries. In other words, it's a bridge. They even went so far as to denounce Kyiv of trying to destabilize them and involve them in the war against Russia by allegedly passing through Georgia a shipment of explosives bound for Putin's country. In other words, far from empathizing with Zelensky's government, what Georgian leadership has done is precisely try to put fear into the population with messages like this one.
This once again confirms what, in principle, the high-ranking officials of the Ukrainian government openly said that they wanted and probably still want: a second front in our country.
Nevertheless, at the end of 2023, Georgia finally became an official candidate to join the European Union. But the truth is that right now, this possibility seems more distant than ever. Beyond the bureaucratic timelines, these days, Georgia seems much closer to throwing itself into Moscow's arms than into Brussels. And do you know what this means? Nothing short of a clear political victory for Putin. A victory that could point the way for Moscow's next attempts in Ukraine, Moldova, and many other countries. That's why this country is suddenly so important. And at this point, we come to the mother of all problems. On 26th of October 2024, there were parliamentary elections in Georgia in which Georgian Dream supposedly won again, led by Irakli Kobakhidze, the current prime minister, and that was precisely the trigger for the large protests. Thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of Georgians have been protesting for months, practically day in and day out, accusing the government of having committed electoral fraud. And the truth, international observers have reported true atrocities. For example, before the elections, it reported that many workers were forced to hand over their identity documents to their bosses to prevent them from voting or to facilitate fraudulent voting. What's more, on the day of the vote, the Georgian Dream continued to campaign right at the polling stations in such a way as to instill a certain atmosphere of intimidation. To give you an idea, at most polling stations, they sent large, intimidating-looking men to watch the voters closely. Cameras were also found inside the voting booths themselves. In other words, in many polling stations, the secret ballot simply disappeared. And that's why the streets are full of demonstrators basically demanding fair elections to prevent Georgia from turning into a kind of Belarus 2.0, because the opponents of the government have it clear. The party in power is nothing more than a puppet party of Moscow, and its actions aimed at censoring the press more and more, stifling the free vote, and all kinds of organizations are pushing the old Georgian dream of becoming part of the European Union further and further away. And precisely because of this, at the protests in Tbilisi, you will see there are usually lots of European Union flags. And keep in mind that according to opinion polls, around 80% of Georgians want to join the Union rather than look to Moscow. But the government doesn't give a damn about that. And let's be clear about one thing. The future of Georgia is being decided right now, in the context of a brutal train wreck that reaches all corners of national politics. For example, the new parliament, which emerged from the last elections, has elected a new president, Mikhail Ivanishvili. The problem is that since the opposition does not recognize the legitimacy of this parliament, former president Salom Zurabichvili claims that she remains the legitimate president of the country. She has even created a parallel presidential office. In other words, a total train wreck.
Georgia's pro-Western president refuses to leave and prepares for showdown.
And on this occasion, we've had the opportunity to speak directly with one of the protagonists of this horrifying story that will not only determine the future of Georgia, but also perhaps that of Ukraine itself. At the latest intense conference in Munich, members of the VisualPolitik team had the opportunity to meet and talk in the YouTube studio with Salom Zurabichvili, the 5th president of Georgia, who also served as foreign minister during the presidency of Mikhail Saakashvili. I'm sure this name rings a bell, right? Well, the fact is that in order to learn how exactly Russia operates, how it could start moving its pawns in Ukraine once the war is over, and also to discover its maneuvers in many other countries in Europe, such as Moldova and Romania, we wanted the Georgian president to tell us much more about her country's experience. And the first question we asked her was about the increasing electoral manipulation and censorship that the government is pushing, and whether this country could still be considered a democracy. This was her response. Let me highlight that this is a clear warning. The Georgia of today could very well be the Ukraine of 10 years from now, if Moscow is not stopped.
Well, I cannot say when it stopped being a democracy, but it's very clear, maybe at the time of the elections. Because when the will of the people is not recognized anymore, then you stop partly already being a democracy. But maybe even more on 1 month after the elections, when the government that is considered by illegitimate and that has gone against the Georgian constitution has decided to repudiate in a way the Article 78 of the Georgian constitution that imposes the obligation to every and each institution of the country to do everything in their competence and their possibilities to favor and to accelerate the Euro-Atlantic integration of Georgia. When, contrary to that article, the government decides to stop the negotiations of going towards the adhesion to the European Union, that is anti-constitutional, that is anti the will of the people, because for 30 years or more since independence, and for many, many years before, when it was the Soviet times and people were dreaming, the support to the Euro-Atlantic integration aims of Georgia was supported by 80% of the population. And that is still the same number when you have opinion polls, and there was one a few days ago that supports that. When you go against that will, you're not a democracy. Added to that, of course, you have all these measures of repression, legislation that every day practically limits the right to free expression, limit the right to free demonstration, limit the individual rights of people. The justice is not a justice system. The courts have arrested and sentenced 600 people in the 3 months that have gone by. Not even one court has deliberated in favor of the defendants. They've all concluded to the accusation of the prosecutor. So that says a lot about the justice system. And by now, in Georgia, there is not one single independent institution that is not controlled by one party, and that one party is controlled by one man, and that one man is most probably controlled by Moscow.
Now, which man is Ivanishvili referring to? Well, this man you see on the screen, Bidzina Ivanishvili. This man is the country's leading oligarch and also the richest Georgian by far. A fortune, thanks to which in 2012 he managed to consolidate power, his political party, the Georgian Dream, a party that he has controlled and that he controls with an iron fist, whether or not he is officially in its structures. Naturally, we're talking about an oligarch, clearly close to Putin. Ivanishvili owes his entire fortune to Russia, particularly to the government of Boris Yeltsin. But in general, he's a guy who always made it a priority to maintain good relations with the Kremlin and also with Vladimir Putin. Well, the general consensus, in fact, is that this oligarch is still de facto in control of the country and has not ceased to be since the Georgian Dream took power in 2012. In fact, everything indicates that the various faces that have passed through his party and the government, including the current president, Mikhail Kavelashvili, and Prime Minister Irakli Kobajidze, are nothing more than puppets. But to what extent are these accusations true, and how has Georgia's political evolution played out? Well, Ivanishvili herself is a true reflection of all that is going on. Although she ran as an independent, she became president precisely with the support of Georgian Dream. Although, naturally, as time went by, she became more and more critical, precisely because of the foreign policy that was more and more inclined towards Russia. Well, the same thing has happened in the rest of the country. Listen up.
Russification, unavoidable?
Some time ago here on VisualPolitik, we told you that there were massive protests in the streets of Georgia against the Georgian Dream government. The reason? The passing of the controversial law on foreign agents, a law that seems straight out of the Kremlin handbook. And in fact, the wording of that law was a sort of copy and paste of a law that the Russian Duma passed in 2012. For those of you who don't remember, the Georgian Foreign Agents Law specifically targets media outlets, NGOs, and other associations whose foreign revenues account for at least 20% of the total. Well, according to the law, all these organizations have a duty to register with the Ministry of Justice as agents of foreign influence. This not only gives the Georgian Dream a roster of organizations to bully, but also subjects them to endless bureaucratic hurdles, inspections, and jail sanctions if they do not scrupulously comply with government guidelines. It was something Putin did in 2012 for a reason. But not surprisingly, this is not the only way Georgia is imitating Russia. On the 13th of December, in the context of the ongoing protests, the government approved another controversial legal reform. Let's just say that the several points of the Code of Administrative Offences were reformed in a very similar way to what Russia has also done in the past. For example, the police have been given powers to detain a person for 48 hours preventatively on the mere suspicion that he or she might commit an administrative offence. Not crimes, but administrative misdemeanors. And we said suspicions, not clear evidence. There's no need for solid evidence, and when it is provided, it's easy to fabricate it, because we're talking about administrative faults. For instance, poorly drafted bureaucratic forms. In other words, the government is applying a policy of maximum pressure, arrests, and rather dubious convictions, which is what Ivanishvili was telling us about earlier. And we say dubious convictions because, following these last elections, only one judge has dared to accept any complaint of electoral fraud, the judge of the District Court of Tetrikskaro. And do you know what happened? Well, he was subjected to a huge smear campaign, while the judges who, quote-unquote, did not find electoral irregularities received bonuses of about $180,000. Now what does that tell you? VisualPolitik community, it's due to things like this that many are clear. Georgia is becoming more and more like Russia. Indeed, Ivanishvili has no doubt about the enormous influence Moscow is having on her country and on the government of the Georgian dream. Check out what she told us.
So Georgia was, for a long time, the testing ground for Russia's objectives and expansions. Georgia was the testing ground in 2008. And it was not taken as a test, and no reaction. And then you had Crimea in 2014, and then the war against Ukraine in 2022. Same thing is happening. We have been, during these last elections, the testing ground of a new strategy of Moscow, which is a hybrid strategy, no more, or maybe, but at this time, instead of military intervention, the soft intervention through hybrid pressure and manipulation of elections. That is happened in Georgia, and is driving the country towards Russia, as we are seeing. It has been tried in Romania, with the TikTok election. It has been tried in Moldova, which was saved by the diaspora votes. And as a consequence, in our election, the diaspora was prevented very largely of voting. And it's something that would be very dangerous in Ukraine. When I heard today the question asked to Mr. Zelensky about the elections, I said, oh, that's another. If Russia has not won the war in Ukraine, that's clear. If Russia does not manage, and I think that it won't happen, to win the peace talks, then it might be tempted to win the elections after.
Moscow is trying to turn Georgia into something akin to a puppet state, and has used the latest elections to do so. Now, many inside and outside the country fear that the country could follow Belarus's trajectory, that is, to increasingly submit to Russian control in all areas, from the economy to defense. This would of course mean a radical change for Moscow's position in the Caucasus, a region where it has been losing a great deal of influence in recent decades, but where things could now change completely. And I've already told you, it's a clear warning. This country has gone from being close, so close to joining the European Union, to moving further and further away from the West. In fact, we also spoke with President Salom Zurabishvili about this matter.
Received the candidate status just a year ago. It seems like a very, very long time. But that was when the whole of the Georgian population came out on the street to demonstrate in favor and to be very happy about this, what was viewed as really receiving the gratification of many years of moving towards these aims and these objectives. So it's very difficult to say what is the cause of the shift, but that it's 180% reversal of the direction that Georgia was following under all its different governments since the independence in 1991. The shift, and that is the program on which this current ruling party, the Georgian Dream, has been elected to bring Georgia into the European Union that was promised on and on again. So probably it's a question of the intensification of the Georgian-Russian pressure on the ruling party and on the ruling man that is ruling the party, which had links with Russia before, and probably there were some strong links that we didn't know about that have now come into active.
In this case, Zurabishvili is not wrong. We have seen it in Georgia, in Moldova, in Romania. We have seen how they tried it in the Baltics and also in countries of the former Yugoslavia. This is something we have to keep in mind, because Russia is using the very democratic systems of the countries around it to gain influence. And the truth is that this is a very profitable strategy. They don't need a single soldier. It's enough to spread money to the right people, to support certain political movements, to know how to use social media networks well, how to finance the creation of a lot of related content, and little else.
It's using, in fact, our democracies and the instruments of democracy against the democracies. And when you do that, there are no borders, there are no distance. When you use the new technologies, when you use the social networks, when you know how to manipulate those, it goes everywhere. And it's very tempting for a country like Russia that knows, that has this background of special services and having invested into those technologies, to think that it can manipulate elections anywhere, because it's using democracy against democracies.
VisualPolitik community, Putin's Russia is learning like no one else how to take advantage of the weaknesses of democratic societies to penetrate the electorate, often without realizing that they're playing Moscow's game. And to some extent, this has also happened in Georgia and has happened in many other countries. Of course, since the war in Ukraine, many countries, especially in Eastern Europe, have been watching closely to prevent Russia from colonizing institutions and manipulating elections. But, as we've said, in Georgia, things are going much easier for Moscow. And take note, because this could also be a strategic place for the Kremlin in the coming years. Why? Well, pay attention.
Taking advantage of the enemy.
Let's be clear, Russia has been trying to destabilize Europe for years by backing pro-Russian candidates in strategic countries, supporting ultra-nationalist parties, and promoting all kinds of disinformation campaigns. Of course, lately, they aren't scoring as many goals as they expected. For example, take a look at this news item.
Kremlin does not recognize Maia Sandu as president of Moldova.
And of course, in Romania, things aren't going particularly well either. Their like-minded candidate, Calin Georgescu, has been thrown out of the electoral process precisely because of his links with Moscow and for illegal financing. And then we have Serbia, one of Russia's historical allies, but which is currently immersed in massive protests against the government over corruption scandals. But that doesn't mean that Moscow will stop trying, among other reasons because Georgia is showing them that they can indeed win.
If Russia consolidates its position and succeeds in pushing Western interests and influence out of Georgia, it will be one of the most consequential strategic victories of the Putin regime since its inception.
Now, why Georgia? And why now? Well, among other reasons, Georgia is key to Europe's energy plans. You see, since the start of the war in Ukraine, the European Union has been trying to reduce its dependence on Russian gas, and to this end, it has made a firm commitment to find new sources of supply. Well, one of the corridors for achieving this goal is precisely the one that passes through Georgia, carrying gas from Azerbaijan to Europe without the need to cross Russian territory. Thus, if Russia succeeds in increasing its control over Georgia, it could come to basically control this corridor and retain some control over the European energy market. In fact, due to everything we've told you about the dubious elections in Georgia and the increasingly clear rapprochement with Moscow, sanctions have even been imposed on the leader of the ruling party and on high-ranking officials in the country.
U.S. sanctions billionaire founder of Georgia Dream Party. EU sanctions on Georgian officials coming to the table despite Hungary's veto threat.
What a surprise! Hungary, again aligned with Moscow's interests, as they are also doing now with the plan to rearm Europe and send aid to Ukraine. In fact, Viktor Orban's role is already so blatant that we couldn't help asking President Zurabishvili for her opinion on the Hungarian leader as well.
The day after the elections, before any results really were known and any observation had been concluded, he came to Georgia to congratulate the new so-called elected government. So very clearly that was the main support. And that also is a big challenge, I think, for the European Union, to not have the ways and means, if the European Union wants to have an effective foreign policy. At one point in time, it will need to devise the mechanisms and the voting mechanisms that would allow it to be efficient and reactive. In our case,
VisualPolitik community, economic sanctions and threats to jeopardize EU membership have already begun. Brussels has also increased its financial support to Georgian civil society, thereby seeking to strengthen those sectors that still advocate a pro-European Georgia. But naturally, the question is the same as always. Will this be enough? If it isn't, in a few years, we could be looking at a Georgia completely aligned with Russia. We would then be talking about a great geopolitical victory. At the moment, the Georgian dream has already taken control of all the country's institutions and is making strides to push Georgia Georgia further and further away from the West, so the future does not look good for the country. And even more worryingly, if successful, Moscow will no doubt seek to replicate this same strategy with much greater intensity in all countries where it is able to do so. It is undoubtedly disturbing. The West should make a move. The problem is that it isn't clear that the US can be counted on. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. As always, thank you for being there. All the best. I'll see you next time.